Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention up at the front. Good morning. My name is Jim Byron. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and welcome to the Nixon Library. This is our first indoor gathering at regular capacity since March of 2020. It's been a very long 15 months. So it certainly is a welcome sight to see all of you here today, as well as our eager conference listeners and participants. Today marks the 50th anniversary since the announcement of the Reversion of Okinawa agreement was signed, after nearly 2 years of negotiations between the Sato and Nixon governments. With this in mind, allow me to briefly set the stage for why we're gathered here in Yorba Linda. President Nixon was a lifelong friend, admirer, and student of Japanese culture and history. His first trip to Japan was in November and December of 1953 on his and Mrs. Nixon's 60-day around-the-world trip as Dwight Eisenhower's vice president and second lady. It was on this trip that he first met Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, the beginning of a long relationship and friendship. They met many times over the years, 1955 in Washington, D.C., again in 1960, when Yoshida was a dinner guest at the Nixons' private residence. In fact, President Nixon wrote an entire chapter of his book, Leaders, about Shigeru Yoshida in 1982. And when the Nixon Library was built in 1990, he requested a life-size bronze statue of Yoshida be included in the Hall of Leaders, alongside Winston Churchill, Charles de Gaulle, and Konrad Adenauer. It was during that 53 visit that Vice President Mrs. Nixon met Emperor Hirohito and Empress Nagako. The two couples met again 18 years later in September 1971 when the President and First Lady flew to Anchorage to welcome the Emperor and Empress during their 90 minutes on U.S. soil, the first time ever for a Japanese emperor. In December of 53, Vice President Nixon delivered a groundbreaking speech to the U.S.-Japan Association in Tokyo, firmly establishing his deep interest and personal involvement in U.S.-Japan relations. Years later, he wrote that the war had been a tragedy, and the time had come to reestablish the tradition of Japanese-American friendship that had previously existed for so many years. The trip also impressed upon me the tremendous spirit of enterprise and discipline in post-war Japan. It seemed as if everyone we saw, from farmers in the fields to factory hands on the assembly lines, was working feverishly. The country was still pretty much on its back in 1953, but after this trip, there was no question in my mind that Japan would recover much more quickly than most Americans had predicted. When I got back to Washington, I became a staunch advocate of American-Japanese ties. During the 1960s, out of office in his wilderness years, Nixon made 7 separate trips to Japan to keep up to date and to see old and new friends. For example, in Tokyo in April 1964, he met for private talks with Prime Minister Ikeda, former Prime Minister Kishi, Foreign Minister Shina, and the Minister of International Trade and Industry. These talks would inform his thinking and worldview as he prepared for another run for the presidency. In October of 1967, his seminal article, Asia After Vietnam, shows his visionary thinking, including the pivotal part that Japan would play in a post-Vietnam world. On January 21st, 1969, his second day in office as president, National Security Study Memorandum 5 was issued, calling for new alternative policies with regard to a full range of U.S.-Japanese issues. The number one issue, the reversion of Okinawa. Prime Minister Sato visited the White House that November, his first trip to Washington as Prime Minister. Okinawa was the first item on the agenda. And 50 years ago today, June 17, 1971, the agreement for reversion was signed in Washington and in Tokyo. Prime Minister Sato sent a moving telegram referring to their earlier November meeting. He wrote, "Thanks for your statesmanship. We were able to reach agreement on the reversion of Okinawa. I'm deeply gratified that these efforts have culminated in the signing of the agreement today." And a few days later, the President replied, "This agreement has added to the strength of ties between us and to the interests which we share in common. I sincerely hope that the spirit which has characterized our negotiation of this agreement will similarly infuse the discussions before us on the other issues in our very durable relationship." In an interview in 1983, former President Nixon spoke about America and Japan in terms of current events and the scope of history. He said, "Look at this country. It's a country with no oil, no significant natural resources. The coal is virtually gone. It has less arable land than the state of California. And yet today, it's the second economic power in the free world. By the end of the century, it may have a per capita income larger than that of the United States. How does that happen? It happened for several reasons. Because of who the Japanese people are, highly intelligent, passion for education, great abilities not only to copy but to innovate, as they are in technology and many other fields. Strong Japan must be maintained if the Soviet attempts to move into China, for example, or other parts of Asia are to be thwarted. And in that connection, therefore, the Japanese-American alliance is absolutely essential. In April 1993, a year before he died, former President Nixon paid his final visit to Japan. Among the many old and new friends he met were Prime Minister Kaifu. As always, even as an elder statesman in his early 80s, he was there to study and he was there to learn. He was still pursuing the vision of a generation of peace and of a world and a time beyond peace, the title of his last posthumously published book. Still earning and deserving the greatest honor history can bestow, the title of Peacemaker. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce another man who has devoted his life to freedom, liberty, and peace, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who served as the 28th National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021. He previously served as Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs and a U.S. Representative to the UN General Assembly. Ambassador O'Brien had practiced law for 30 years in Los Angeles and has rejoined the firm that he founded with Judge Stephen Larson, Larson LLP, as of counsel. Would you please join me in welcoming Ambassador O'Brien?
Well, thanks for that terrific introduction, Jim. What a nice day to look out and see everyone. I don't see too many masks, and we're reopened. We're back. Orange County's back. California's back. It's just terrific to be here with you. We've kept going at the Nixon Foundation and the Nixon Seminar. We've been doing our events for the past several months, but we've been doing it by Zoom, and we haven't been with all our friends and colleagues. So welcome. So we're here today to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Reversion of Okinawa Prefecture to Japan. And there's probably no place more fitting to celebrate this signal accomplishment than here at the Richard Nixon Library and Birthplace. It was June 17th, 1971 that the agreement was signed, both in Tokyo and Washington. We'll be joined a little later today by two honored guests, Japan's Ambassador Tomita and its Consul-General Muto. And we're going to welcome their excellencies to Orange County, to the Nixon Library and Birthplace. We've got a whole plethora of VIPs here, and I'm going to offend people by just mentioning a couple, but I do want to thank Chris Cox. He's the grandson of President Nixon and brings the family's love of this special piece of property with him every time he comes out here from New York. So thank you for being here, Chris, and thank you for representing your great family, your mom and your aunt, great American. I've also got two of my colleagues from the Trump administration are here. Mary Kissel, who served as a senior advisor to Secretary Pompeo. Mary and I spent plenty of time on the Secretary's plane, flying around the world on various missions. And Mary did great work. She brought the ideological argument to the table to make sure that we weren't being outspun by the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians. And I appreciate all your great work on the communications front and communicating for the U.S. And we also have Kim Reed, who was the first woman chairman of the Exim Bank, which is an independent government agency in Washington. And Kim and I spent a lot of time traveling around the world, including Asia Pacific. And I always loved having Kim on the plane with me because she carried a big fat checkbook. And I could come tell people that I represent the president and that we've got, and talk about the security concerns, but politicians are the same everywhere. And when you've got someone with you who can write $1 billion check to help an American company sell 5G to one of our partners, it was amazing how interested the presidents and prime ministers were in talking to Kim. They'd quickly shake my hand and go over and see where the money was. So that's some things haven't changed. They're the same overseas as they are here. And we have a number of other great guests that you'll meet and hear from on the panels today. So I'm honored to participate. So during my time as National Security Advisor, I visited Japan on several occasions. And Mr. Shigeru Kitamura was probably my closest colleague, or one of my closest colleagues among the National Security Advisors around the world. He was Japan's National Security Advisor. He had the confidence of Prime Minister Abe and then the confidence of Prime Minister Suga. and we were on the phone, even due to the time difference, either late at night or early in the morning, almost every week or two. As a young officer in the U.S. Army, I did one of my reserve trainings at Camp Zama, just south of Tokyo, which, by the way, has a beautiful golf course on the base. Japan's a beautiful country. It's a close ally of the United States, and it's a very special place to me personally. I don't think the Japan-U.S. alliance was ever stronger than it was during the Trump administration. And thus I was very pleased to see that the very first visitor to President Biden at the White House was Prime Minister Suga. I think that represented continuity of the policy that we instituted, and shows that this relationship goes beyond partisan politics and is critical to both countries, both to Japan and to the United States. And I thought the gesture of President Biden inviting Prime Minister Suga to see him at the White House, even notwithstanding, I should say, the COVID restrictions, sent a strong message to our friends, but also to our adversaries. As we reflect on the U.S.-Japan relationship and discuss today what the future holds for our two nations, we can be thankful for the monumental step taken by President Nixon half a century ago. President Nixon made many decisions during his career, and especially during his time as president, in the foreign policy and national security fronts that met with criticism. This was one of them. But as he demonstrated time and time again, and we're seeing now, sometimes it's taken us 50 years to see the strategic wisdom of what President Nixon did. And the 1971 Okinawa Reversion Agreement with Japan is one decision that continues to show and demonstrate President Nixon's strategic genius. Think for a moment what would have happened if even if President Nixon had retreated from the full-throated criticism of his decision to return Okinawa at the time. A lot of national security hawks said that it's strategic property, we can't give it up, it's important to U.S. national security in the Pacific. But President Nixon understood how important it was to return Okinawa to the people of Japan. If the United States still governed Okinawa today with its 1.5 million inhabitants, there's no doubt that it would have been an incredible sore point in the U.S.-Japan relationship. And that friction would have hindered many of the great accomplishments and developments that our nations have made together over the past 5 decades. More importantly, the Chinese Communist Party would have almost certainly argued that the Okinawa Prefecture and the Ryukyu Island chain were not Japanese territory, as evidenced by continued U.S. administration of those territories. Now, 50 years after the return of the prefecture to Japan, any such claim by the Chinese Communists is universally viewed as being entirely without merit. Okinawa plays a critical role in U.S. and Japanese security, notwithstanding the fact that it's now part of Japan, fully part of Japan. U.S. military bases on the island project American power in the Western Pacific. This presence is critical given the rise of China as an assertive and aggressive economic, political, and military competitor of both the United States and Japan. The United States and Japan consider the protection of major sea lines of communications, particularly the Strait of Malacca and the Bashi Channel, to be vital to our alliance's national security. A tremendous amount of trade flows through the Indo-Pacific, feeding the economies of Japan and the United States, and disruption of that trade by any potential adversary would have devastating economic consequences for both countries. U.S. Marines and U.S. Air Force Airmen stationed on Okinawa are ideally suited to respond to any crises involving sea lines of communications or other contingencies in the Western Pacific. U.S. forces on Okinawa work hand in glove with the Japanese maritime, ground, and air self-defense forces. And I can tell you from personal experience, those forces are those Japanese forces with whom we work, our allied partners, are highly capable forces. The nations of the Indo-Pacific now face the Communist Party of China, which has embarked on the greatest peacetime naval buildup since Germany built the Kaiserlich Marine prior to World War I. And that's not to mention China's massive investments in ground, air, missile, and cyber forces. Accordingly, as I've said many times in the past, the U.S.-Japan National Security Alliance is perhaps the most important security relationship in the world. The strength of that relationship was in no small part solidified by President Nixon's decision 50 years ago to end one of the last vestiges of World War II, the occupation of Okinawa, and to normalize the security relationship with Japan. So to get today together, Washington and Tokyo, with our allies in the region and our friends, will continue to foster a free, open, and prosperous Indo-Pacific. It's now my privilege to introduce Ambassador Gadi Vazquez. Ambassador Vazquez was the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for Edison and Southern California Edison. But before joining Edison, he served as a U.S. Ambassador to the UN in Rome. Now that's, as I told him when we were walking in here, it's probably the best ambassadorship in the world. You get to live in Rome for 4 years, and you get to do great things like making sure the world's hungry are fed. And so that's a terrific ambassadorship. You must have been very good friends with President Bush to have landed that, because there are a few ambassadorships, Jerusalem, Dublin, Court of St. James, that there's a real fight over, and Rome's right at the top of that list. Prior to serving as our ambassador to the UN in Rome, Ambassador Vazquez was the director of the Peace Corps from 2002 to 2006. So I guess it was probably a little thank you for having done the hard work, or the Peace Corps hard work, for 4 years. Earlier in his career, he served as an Orange County supervisor and as Chief Deputy Appointment Secretary for our good friend who we lost a couple of years ago, Governor Duke-Majan, and as a police officer for the city of Orange. I mean, what a CV ambassador. So it's now my great pleasure to introduce him. Let me close by saying, may God bless Japan, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Ambassador O'Brien. I'm going to step to the podium for just a moment before we seat ourselves for the panel discussion. It is a great honor and a great privilege to be here at the Nixon Presidential Library and to be able to participate on this particular panel, which is going to address the history of the Senkaku Islands and the 1971 Reversion Agreement. We are fortunate today to have a very distinguished panel of leaders in the administration during President Nixon's presidency, but also the opportunity to hear from some of those who have studied intimately and profoundly the aspects of this agreement. And we're going to have a discussion that focuses on Japan post-World War II and the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Vice President Nixon's relationship with Japan and Japanese leaders in the 1950s and 60s, and discuss a little bit the negotiations between the Sato and Nixon administrations on the reversion of Okinawa, why, when, how, where, and also the announcement of the revision. So I am delighted, and I want to preface these introductions by saying that two of our participants are going to appear on the screen because they're going to be joining us virtually, and then two of us will be up here on the stage for this panel conversation. I'd first like to introduce Dr. Nobumasa Akiyama, who is a professor in the School of International and Public Policy at the Hitotsubashi University. And he joins us today live from Tokyo, where I'm told it is very, very early in the morning. From 2016 to 2018, Dr. Akiyama served as Minister Counselor to the Permanent Mission of Japan to the international organizations in Vienna, a noted branch of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is a noted expert on disarmament and arms control. Also joining us virtually today, Richard V. Allen was U.S. National Security Advisor under President Ronald Reagan from 1981 to 1982. During the 1968 campaign for the presidency, he was Foreign Policy Advisor for Richard Nixon and the Nixon campaign, and was appointed Deputy National Security Advisor in the Nixon administration, and later served as Chief Advisor to Peter Peterson on international economics. He is a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and an international business consultant. Joining me today on the platform is Dr. Luke Nichter. He is a James H. Cavanaugh Professor in Presidential Studies at Chapman University. He is the author of the Nixon Tapes, Volumes 1 and 2, both New York Times bestsellers. He is also the author of Nixon in Europe, and most recently, The Last Brahmin, the first biography of Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. So I'd like to invite Dr. Nichter to join me up here on the platform, and we'll welcome our other guests virtually. So in an era of technology and virtual connections, we have been told that we would see our two counterparts or friends on the screens here. I don't see them. There they are, just right on cue. Well, that's excellent. Welcome our two panelists. Welcome, Dick Allen, and welcome, Dr. Akiyama. We're delighted to have you. Hopefully this is a sound check. You're giving me the nod that you can hear us, so thank goodness for good technology. And thank you to all the technical experts out there who are making this possible. We appreciate it. I'd like to start this morning by taking this question of residual sovereignty back to the San Francisco Peace Treaty. Right after the end of World War II, when all parties agreed that the United States was the sole administering authority of the Nansei Shoto south of 29 degrees north latitude, which included the Ryukyu and Daitu Islands, the U.S. made sure to note with some frequency that its administration was temporary. But it wasn't really, of course, as we know now, until 1971 that the revision actually took place. So we're going to examine some of those events that took place over that 25-year period this morning. And Dr. Akiyama, I'd like to begin with you, if I may, coming to us live from Japan. Can you set the stage for our audience here at the Nixon Library and those watching on the live stream? What was the state of the Senkaku Islands as World War II was over, and why were these islands so significant to the balance of power in the region?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Nixon Library and organizer of this conference. In fact, when receiving the invitation, I thought that I was going to talk about sort of arms control, which was a kind of great product of the great strategist, President Nixon. But so this is a kind of surprise attack for me that I was I was asked to address on the Senkaku Islands. But in fact, the Senkaku has been very important and significant in Japan's security and possibly the strategic environment in East Asia. And so, as you correctly pointed out, the residual sovereignty issue is the very, very difficult question. And in fact, in San Francisco, during the San Francisco conference, interestingly, the PRC or the Chinese Communist Party said that that the Senkaku or Okinawa has never been out of Japan's control. So, in fact, PRC recognized the Japan's sovereignty of Okinawa and Senkaku Islands. But of course, as many people are aware, that the Senkaku was kind of separated from the Okinawa sovereignty. Then, because of that, the Senkaku has been now the kind of thorn of the U.S.-Japan alliance, but at the same time, Japan-China relationship, and also Japan-Taiwan relationship. So, this current sort of outstanding question on the settlement of the alignments, strategic alignments between Japan and the United States, Japan, Taiwan, Japan, China, in fact, started from the beginning of the post-war history. And I think my probably take on the interpretation of the contemporary interpretation of the issue in this in terms of significance, the contemporary security environment is that since the 1950s, the ambiguity on the sovereignty over the Senkaku is posing us a great sort of a question on what alliance can do and what alliance need to do and what alliance should do in order to check the rise of China, in order to deter the Chinese sort of expansion and assertiveness in East Asia. So I defer to the great historian on the colleague panelists on further details about the the legal and political arrangement of the Senkaku issue. But I stop here and just like to say this is a very, very significant strategic question that we are still facing. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Akiyama. We'll probably be delving into that topic a little more as we discuss other topics as well. Dr. Nichter, welcome. And Richard Nixon was so often in the 1950s the highest ranking or near highest ranking official to visit so many countries around the world. Coming off the end of World War II as Britain's empire transitioned into the Commonwealth and former colonies became democracies, as was mentioned earlier, one of those countries that Richard Nixon visited was Japan. In 1953, the VP and Second Lady Nixon met Emperor Hirohito only 8 years after the end of the war. President Nixon says on the Nixon tapes that by 1969 he had visited Japan 7 times. Can you talk a little bit about the personal interest that the President had in Japan and how he viewed the alliance between the U.S. and Japan by the time that he became president in 1969?
Sure. Thank you very much, and I'm sure Dr. Allen can fill in any gaps here that I might miss. But I think let's start back with the 1966 highly successful midterm elections for Congress, and the day after, former Vice President Richard Nixon announces a break from politics. It wasn't a break from work. I think he worked even harder over the next 6 months by his around-the-world trips that led to Asia after Vietnam, his Bohemian Grove speech, where he gave signals about what his thoughts were about the future of East Asia. And I think he approached the issue in terms of really 3 different contexts. I think he approached the issue in terms of the Cold War context, in terms of superpower relations between the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. Meanwhile, the United States is beginning negotiations to wind down its involvement in Vietnam in the war. I think the second context was the evolving security situation in East Asia. And I think many Americans don't realize that when you talk about Okinawa and look on a map, it's much closer to Taipei or Shanghai and even Hong Kong than Tokyo. And I think that the third situation, the third context that President Nixon approached this issue in his thinking in the late 60s was the requirements of domestic economic and political needs. Just as in West Germany, Japan was 25 years into a miraculous economic recovery. The United States was looking to rebalance some of its relationships with allies. Both nations had transformed themselves politically, economically, into regional leaders. And I think we see the glimpse looking forward of President Nixon's strategy in the presidency of, instead of just superpowers and everyone else, establishing kind of regional security pillars and regional powers. And you see this in terms of the Shah in Iran. You see this in terms of West Germany, Ostpolitik, and renegotiating its relations with its eastern neighbors. And finally, you see it in terms of Japan. So I think it's really the nexus between these sort of 3 contexts is what informed his thinking in the late 1960s.
Dick, you were the Nixon campaign's foreign policy advisor in 1968, and you spent an incredible amount of time with the candidate in 1968. Was Japan an issue, and were the islands an issue specifically that was on the campaign's radar in 1968? Dick, I think you're on mute.
Beg your pardon?
There you are. Now we can hear you.
Someplace, I don't know, modern technology.
Hear, hear.
During 1968, Japan was quite important. But I want to just speak for a minute about the prelude to 68 in regards to Japan. In 1967, I traveled from the Hoover Institution, where I was permanently, to New York, met with Mr. Nixon, and had a long discussion with him about a trip I was about to take to Japan. And he said, well, I'm going to write a couple of letters for you that you can take with you and use for important people in Japan. And I'd like you to talk to them as well. I said, yes, sir, I would. But he asked also that if I had any ideas of my own. And I said, yes, I do. And reversion was on the top of my mind. That is, reversion of Okinawa to Japan. And it was also very much on the top of his mind. And I said, then, therefore, do I have your permission to raise this with the very important people with whom you are connecting me? And the answer was yes, indeed. So raise it, but not negotiate it. Simply raise the issue, determine their level of interest, and move ahead. Come back and have a discussion with Mr. Nixon, and next steps would be taken. So that's what I did. I carried letters from Mr. Nixon. I took them down to the Japanese ambassador in Washington to make sure that things were set up for me when I arrived in Japan. And as I arrived in Japan, that was precisely the case. My visit was taken into hand by the Cabinet Research Office, which is a critically important part of the foreign office at the time. And I was led hand in hand, so to speak, from one important person to another. And I carried a letter to the former Prime Minister of Japan, Fukuda Takeo, who became my very, very close friend over the next several years. So having visited, I returned, had the discussion about the interest of no question about the interest of the Japanese side. I returned to New York and reported all of this to Mr. Nixon. And pretty soon he decreed that I should leave the Hoover Institution at Stanford and move to New York, which I said I did not want to do. The way they affected my removal to New York was to, on a leave of absence from Hoover, was to send a very wealthy donor of the Hoover Institution to New York from the Nixon campaign and put the pressure on. And pretty soon I was sprung and I was off to New York City, more or less against my will. With a family of 6 kids, my wife drove a Chevrolet station wagon across the United States with 6 kids without seat belts, I might add, while I flew. And that was quite the most important achievement of the summer was her safely reaching the East Coast, where we had a summer home in New Jersey and they could put in. So that led to a really interesting situation where I was then subsequently introduced to an exceptionally wide range of Japanese interests in things of this nature in the government and also outside the government. So more about that later.
The scenario that you described about your movement from the West Coast to the East Coast, glad that played out well, ultimately.
I might add one thing. One thing that's very important here. Without RN's article, October 1967 Foreign Affairs, called Asia After Vietnam, none of this would have happened. And in that article, which I could not sell to any newsman as in the position of Director of Foreign Policy and National Security Matters in the campaign, I couldn't sell it to anybody to read it and get serious about it and write about it, because in that article is foretold the forthcoming meeting with Japan, not directly, but again, obliquely, which was Mr. Nixon's way. So,
well, that's a good segue, because once you were in the White House, President Nixon met with Prime Minister Sato just months after he assumed the presidency. Can you elaborate on why that was, and why did the administration, if you could just elaborate a little, because now I'm talking in the context of the White House itself, is why this was an imperative in foreign policy at that particular time? Was there something?
Well, he met with whom, you're saying?
When President, with Prime Minister Sato, only months after becoming president.
Yes.
Why was that such an important goal of American foreign policy so early in the president's tenure? Can you cast some light on that?
Well, yes, RN like to operate at the top and would like to have conversations from which would flow secondary considerations, such as the actions to be taken. And I believe that was a perfect example of it.
Good. Professor, any reflections or thoughts, reaction to what you've just heard in terms of the
I think I would add, I think there was also an economic element to the timing of all of this too. I think one of the experiences of the Johnson administration that the Nixon administration also understood is that a lesson of the 1960s was that guns and butter, the Great Society and Vietnam War, were both too expensive. And I think part of the American goal in the Nixon years was to rebalance and over these allied relationships. And so even leading today in 1971, you have concerns over gold and the link between the dollar. You have trade and textiles. You have Japan really moving from, becoming really a first-tier ally. Is the impression you get in a lot of the records and in the Nixon tapes. And more Japan is being mentioned in the same breath as the American relationships with Great Britain, with West Germany, with France, certainly on trade, in terms of economics, where Japan had gone from needing aid and recovery, just like West Germany, to not just standing on its own, but by the late 1960s becoming even a commercial competitor, a friendly commercial competitor of the United States. And so a dramatic transformation, economically, politically. And so I think what Nixon recognized is that what we were talking about was really the end of the post-war era was taking place. And we were entering a new kind of yet unknown, unnamed phase in history that was kind of being built. The plane was being built while it was in flight. And so I think he recognized the importance of change, that a new pivot was occurring in Asia. And I think that's why Japan was central to so many of these topics, in terms of monetary, economic, trade, and of course political on the islands.
So Dick, coming back to you, who was leading the negotiations and driving the process at that time?
He used diplomatic channels, and
yes.
The idea was to try to enlist the State Department to be as enthusiastic as Mr. Nixon had been, and to get them to do the homework just to read the October 1967 article. That was the hardest homework that was ever assigned. By the time, shortly thereafter, after my visits, and I left the Nixon administration, and as a result, joined a presidential commission on international trade and investment policy. And there I carried the flag not only for reversion, ultimate reversion, but also for Japanese-American relationships. And then the automobile sector mentioned became a really sore point. And all of a sudden we were confronted with Japanese automobiles all over the place. The question was whether they were going to overrun our market. There was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment in the country, and the automobiles didn't particularly help, but they were good automobiles. And it was hard to keep them out of our market. And so that became a real issue at the time, and it was but ultimately the Japanese had to provide us with a special ambassador for that purpose, just to come and negotiate automobiles. But we thought that there was an amazing opportunity in promoting U.S. trade to Japan. Just more difficult to get U.S. brands into Japan than it ever was to get Japanese brands into the United States. Now, they were better organized. They had the channels set up for themselves, and either they use existing frameworks or set them up themselves, as I said, and they succeeded, whereas American products didn't succeed very well, and American automobiles did not succeed very well in Japan.
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Akiyama, you are regarded as an international public policy professor, professional historian. Can you take us through the Sato government's position on the matter of the reversion of Okinawa, and why this was being pursued and supported by the Sato government as well? What were some of the Japanese domestic and political considerations? Because in reviewing and researching and reading preparation for today's panel, I know that he had made, I believe, a 3-year commitment to achieve the reversion in a period of 3 years. Can you walk us a little bit through some of the backstory of the reversion as it relates to the government of Prime Minister Sato?
Right, thank you. I think this is a very critical for actually Japanese identity. When the sovereignty of Senkaku, that Okinawa was recognized as that of Japan, then at the San Francisco Peace Treaty, it's been a kind of long desire for the entire Japanese to regain the cohesiveness of the nation. That is the reversion of the territories which were under trusteeship of United States. So the Ogasawara was returned earlier, but then the Sato administration's very serious mandate was to regain the sovereignty over Okinawa. And also the important was the return, the reversion of Okinawa must come with the sort of elimination of nuclear weapons from the Okinawa. So the reversion without nuclear weapon was kind of its manifesto or promise with the people. So the Sato was very enthusiastic about the negotiation on the return of the sovereignty over Okinawa. And also another critical issue was how that is not about Sato administration itself, but how the sovereignty over Okinawa and the sovereignty over Senkaku are kind of coupled or decoupled through the Taiwan side. So I would argue that when we try to understand the contemporary frame of the Senkaku issue, we also need to look at the two triangles. One is Japan, Taiwan, and United States. How United States negotiated with Taiwan and Japan, and also the Japan, United States, and China. And particularly as Mr. Allen mentioned, there was a very serious trade issues. And one of the issue is the textile trade. So there was a overflow of textile products from East Asian countries to the United States. And so that issue was one of the most important, the other issues between Japan and the United States. And that was kind of linked with the reversion of Okinawa. So on the US side, I think the United States, the Nixon administration need to deal with the control over the overflow of the textile products from Asian countries. And so in that respect, I think US government need to take care of Japan, at the same time, Taiwan, and Taiwan at that time became aware of the sovereignty over Okinawa, along with the Senkaku. So I think that made the situation a little bit complicated.
Interesting. I'll put this question out to both of the professors on this panel. The gross national product in Okinawa in 1968 was $644 million. 260 million of it was derived from U.S. military spending. I think Professor Akiyama alluded to it somewhat generally. Professor Nichter, was this a factor, do you think, to be considered to be weighed in the balance?
Well, it was certainly a concern as we approached 1971, because this was a time, again, most Americans don't realize that the dollar was still linked to gold at $35 an ounce. And the United States maintained at Fort Knox in Kentucky the appropriate gold reserves based on the number of dollars that were in circulation. And we had really reached the danger level by the summer of 1971. So right in the same time period as what we're talking about today, 50 years ago. 50 years ago in the summer of 1971, the United States had dropped below $10 million of gold in Fort Knox for over $30 billion of printed dollars that were in circulation. You can see that will catch up to you at a certain while when you print money and you don't have gold to back it. And so in the same time period here, addressing inflows and outflows of spending. And in terms of trade imbalances, the United States had a trade imbalance with Japan, with West Germany, especially places where we had large numbers of troops that were stationed overseas. And so I think it was a question, where can we make cuts realistically? And especially in the case of Japan and in West Germany, both nations, I think, took a similar path in terms of end of World War II being disarmed, large numbers of American troops stationed there, dramatic economic development and growth and return to stability and responsibility in the world. And so I think all of these issues were also in the mindset of President Nixon in order to correct these economic imbalances that occurred. And I think possibly what we're talking about today, could even have occurred a few years earlier, but the U.S. had consumed so much political capital and energy in the Vietnam War that I think there was a backlog of issues that had to be addressed around the world. And so in the first 2 or 3 years of the Nixon administration, look at the range of activity in all the places of the world, not just because you had a leader with a personal inclination to take on these issues, because I do think the U.S. also had to rebalance its own place in the world. And I think there was a number of backlogs. So I think economic issues, monetary issues were reaching ahead at the same time as the Okinawan issue in the summer of 1971.
Are you able to comment on the political climate in Washington once the administration had advanced this agreement? What kind of a climate the president of the administration encountered in Washington? Congress and so forth.
Nixon he was known for his Nixon shocks. These sort of dramatic announcements where even sometimes his closest allies weren't sure what was coming. He loved to keep the press off guard. Both houses of Congress were controlled by the Democrats for all 5.5 years, so he liked to keep them off guard. And sometimes even his closest aides would comment, I wasn't quite sure that's what the announcement was going to be, or he would silo work so that sometimes not other than maybe Henry Kissinger might not see kind of the whole picture at times. And so you look at the summer of 1971, and not just Okinawa, but you have July 15th on television announcing that President Nixon would be the first president to visit the People's Republic of China in the coming year. A month later, on August 15th, preempting Bonanza on Sunday night on television, was announcing the temporary severance of the link between the U.S. dollar and gold at $35 an ounce, and that would take a couple years until 1973 to work out. But this whole summer was a series of major announcements, of major shocks, and I think that was very characteristic of kind of Nixon, who he was as a leader.
Dick, do you have a perspective on that in terms of the political climate? Dick, let me put that on hold for a second. Professor Akiyama, any reaction or comments to the question about the expenditure, military spending in Okinawa in 1968 as a consideration or a factor in the negotiations?
Well, I don't think I have anything to add on that part, but just would like to comment on the so-called Nixon shocks. The two announcements. That one is the president's visit to China, and also the another one is sort of the suspension of convertibility of gold and dollar. They are remembered by Japanese as Nixon shocks. So, the former had a really great implication on our strategic consideration first. And second one is more about sort of the kind of fear that might lead Japanese economy into confusion. And we are aware of this sort of a trade surplus vis-a-vis United States. So we understand the logic, but still, those announcements were made without any prior sort of a thorough consultation with Japan. So that was, even though the basic tone of the US-Japan relationship was excellent, but those huge strategic decisions, two decisions, are kind of remembered by Japanese as shocks. So that also set kind of some tones for the rest of the sort of negotiation and the relationship with the Nixon administration on the sort of Senkaku or the relationship with China as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologize for jumping around here, but I didn't want to preclude Professor Akiyama from commenting on the issue of the military spending in Okinawa. But I want to come back to Dick Allen to follow up on the question that the professor was commenting on about the political climate in Washington when this agreement was ready to be advanced and made public. What was the political climate like for this agreement as a matter of foreign policy?
Well, if you speak of the general climate toward moving ahead with reversion, is this what you're speaking of?
Yes, correct. Yes.
Well, this was
specific to Washington, of course.
This was slow and steady in Washington. Reversion of Okinawa was not a burning issue. The opening to China, as Professor pointed out, was one of the contributing shoku, as the Japanese called it, and that was an unwelcome surprise. And there was another variant of that in the automobile shoku, namely the decisions we were taking to try to inhibit Japanese automobiles, and with that, generally speaking, Japanese products entering the United States. So there was a great deal of residual ill feeling, I think, about various topics relating to Japan, which found their expression in this so-called shoku movement. And it was too bad that we didn't take psychological steps, and I might add here, psychological warfare steps could be deployed to lessen that shock. We did not anticipate any of that shock. And the shock visits by Kissinger to Tokyo were exceptionally unfriendly, received an exceptionally unfriendly reception in Japan.
Thank you for that.
If I can add one thing.
Yeah.
I was thinking of something that Dick Allen mentioned earlier, going back to Asia after Vietnam in 1967 in Foreign Affairs, is that some of the issues that we're talking about were received as shocks. Yet Nixon had made several signals that this was the direction that he intended to move. And I don't know that these were taken any more seriously in Washington than they were in capitals around the world. But a number of signals had been sent, I think sent fairly. Now we can look today with hindsight and say that's what he was talking about. And you can look back even further and see President Johnson beginning, say, in 1966, as he started to move more to the negotiating table to get out Vietnam and consider other alternatives to winding down American military involvement in Southeast Asia besides just victory on the battlefield, but possibly victory at the negotiating table. You see, even President Johnson, as early as 66 and 67, is suggesting there needs to be a new relationship between the United States and China. And I mean, Nixon wasn't the only one. I think he's gotten the lion's share of the credit. But I mean, a number of signals have been sent. But I think these were so dramatic. I mean, we've lived with these for 50 years, and we kind of assumed this was just the fabric of U.S. foreign policy that evolved organically over time. But I think a number of signals have been sent, and I don't think people were very willing to take those seriously because these were so dramatic. And so I think that's one element here I think that's important, is that these were shocks. I mean, this was something brand new in U.S. foreign policy. But the signals and the groundwork had been laid for several years.
Interesting.
I'd like to also point out that one of the major shocks being the opening of relations with China. This was something entirely Mr. Nixon's idea. While Henry Kissinger was the messenger, he was the messenger only. He did not open China. It was done exclusively by the strategy laid down by President Nixon. And that's an important point to make. And the element of surprise may have been very well calculated by Henry to utilize for his own purposes in his own moment. But the major work and the heavy lifting here was all done by RN, Richard Nixon.
And he announced his trip to the People's Republic of China 31 days after the Reversion Agreement. I think that's the historical date, correct?
Yep.
Good. So let me talk a little bit about the diplomatic side of things and welcome your comments. If you have a perspective, face-to-face diplomacy is of great value in these kinds of circumstances. Any of you, maybe Dick, I'll start with you. You probably had the front row seat to some of this, but how would you characterize the interaction, the relationship between Prime Minister Sato and President Nixon? Did you have a line of sight to that, and maybe some commentary on how that contributed to the outcome?
Well, I think it worked quite well because both men were candid with each other in the discussions. A lot would reside later on with the implementation of things, including the work done by Alexis Johnson in the State Department and others in the State Department who received no mention whatever for their work, and on the NSC staff. So there were people who worked that problem as well. John Holdridge was a perfect example of a long-serving bureaucrat in the NSC staff who wielded a mighty stick, and was an important man. So there were people who were interested in it, and I worked it from the standpoint of with Pete Peterson on the international economic side. And then you had the entire Commerce Department of Maurice Stans, which was very interested in developing a structure for dealing with the Chinese and the Japanese upon reversion of Okinawa, particularly, because that would be a signal for many, many other things to follow. If we get the reversion straight, then it would be a major, major accomplishment. I might say, the irony of a young Marine first lieutenant named Alan, my grandson, who happens to be in Okinawa and in and out of Okinawa and Japan at present.
Thank you. Professor Nichter, you've studied Richard Nixon. Any thoughts in terms of the dynamics of the relationship between Prime Minister Sato and the President?
You know, so I have heard Richard Nixon speak a lot on the tapes. And, you know, there used to be a joke I told when our 7-year-old daughter was born. I think there was a time when she thought Richard Nixon was her grandfather because she heard his voice so much bouncing off the hallways and being played from the speakers of my computer. But before you accuse me of child abuse or anything else, you know, I think Nixon, like other leaders, didn't always get it right. But what was unique about Nixon was his time of study and preparation for the job. And he didn't require on-the-job training.
That's right.
That's unique in politics. I mean, politicians don't have time to go to a library and read books that are all about this big on a subject. And, you know, while the focus of his wilderness years is often the wilderness, wandering around directionless and aimless, he wasn't directionless. And I think that's what's unique. As you look, at the introduction at the outset here, we heard excerpts of his first visit to Japan, first state visit of any foreign leader to Japan in 1953. I mean, that's the length of the... So when he reached the presidency in the late 1960s, in all the major countries of the world, you have an average of 15 or 20 years of knowledge, of relationships that you can draw on. And Americans don't always understand that other nations in the world, with their diplomatic posts in Washington, you know, the U.S. ambassador might be the next foreign minister when they go home. They might be the next prime minister. I mean, this is a senior diplomatic post to be in Washington. And so by the time Nixon became president, they had also moved up over the 15 or 20 years in these countries. And so he became president as someone who had exceptional preparation, but so did his foreign counterparts, who had kind of risen in seniority along with him throughout the 50s and 1960s. And so I think that's what strikes me about Richard Nixon as being kind of a unique figure in the presidency. Again, among many exceptional people over 200 plus years, is that he had time to think and write and prepare. And when you look at the archive, the research room, you know, on the floor below us, you see he was a writer. I mean, he was a thinker. And his ideas, you can see played out in writing, his ideas. And it's really fascinating to think how much time he spent focusing on study and reading and doing the hard work. He was his own foreign policy advisor. I mean, he had Dick Allen, he had Henry Kissinger, he had George Shultz, he had John Connally, and other really kind of A-list political figures across the political spectrum. But he was his own foreign policy, and he relied on his own instincts and not those of others, often going against the grain, going against the consensus in his cabinet and among his senior staff. And so I think it's important to make the point that he really was a unique figure for his time and in American history. And he devoted a lot of personal time and work to understanding the parts of the world that he operated in.
Thank you for that. Very, very good.
I'd add that pay close attention to Luke Nichter, in my view, because he has it just about right in every respect. Mr. Nixon prepared when he saw that he was gaining, shall we say, gaining momentum, even well before the election. My visit to and bringing back the report from my meeting with the Japanese that I met with there, all high-ranking. The three that I met with had been political prisoners in the same jail. They were influential, and he was able to create back channels of his own through that method. So therefore, he had a much better understanding and knowledge of the Japanese situation and its degree of ripeness for restoration, not only in bilateral relationships, but Japan in the world. And Mr. Nixon was the man who replaced Japanese in the world, Japan in the world. Once the reversion of Okinawa and a number of other matters had been handled. Really, really important. So Luke Nichter has his hands on this material, and I would go there for verification.
Thank you, Dick. Thank you. Professor Akiyama, any remarks or views, perspectives on the relationship between Prime Minister Sato and President Nixon in terms of the dynamics of achieving this outcome?
Well, I think that Prime Minister Sato really heavily relied on the decision by the president himself, and I think it's well known, secret is that the kind of secret envoy Professor Wakaizumi had a direct communication with Dr. Kissinger, and they negotiated on this, particularly on the secret nuclear agreement. But at the same time, my actually observation through the study on the President Nixon's achievement, it seems he had a very good sort of strategic balanced view on what to sort of prioritize the issues. And for example, when the discussion was made on the how they're going to deal with the textile issue and the reversion of Okinawa, I think the economic side people like Mr. Peterson insisted to actually use the reversion of Okinawa as a kind of negotiation card for the gaining from Japan on the sort of the gaining concession from Japan in the textile negotiation. But that was actually rejected by president, saying that the Nixon president had already made enough commitment, and it's already kind of too important to withdraw. So he had a very good sort of sense of priority, and also he had a vision of what would be the importance of relationship with Japan in the context of sort of a overall political agenda.
Thank you, Professor. I wanted to end the line of questioning or discussion today with the question about the relationship between Prime Minister Sato and President Nixon. And I did so because in preparing for today's gathering, researched and read some of the communication correspondence, because I was privileged to have known President Nixon, have spent considerable time with him, was instrumental in the development of this presidential library. And so I came to know the president as someone who has been mentioned by Dick Allen and others. The professor liked to communicate and write. And I was always intrigued by the historical data that exists about how much emphasis he placed on and valued relationships, particularly in the foreign policy arena. And I'll read you something that is that's striking. It's part of the protocol, part of the process, but nevertheless I think reflected a certain bond, shall we say, or openness between these two world leaders. Dear Mr. President, we have just completed the signing of the Okinawa Reversion Agreement since my meeting with you in November of 1969, in which, thanks to your statesmanship, we were able to reach agreement on the reversion of Okinawa. Sustained negotiations were carried out between our two governments. I am deeply gratified these efforts have culminated in the signing of the agreement today. I am resolved to renew my efforts to further promote friendly ties between the United States and Japan. Prime Minister Sato of Japan. And then there was a second letter that was addressed to the President, again from the Office of the Prime Minister. And I'll read you an excerpt which, as a former director of the Peace Corps, anytime I hear talk about peace, it certainly raises and piques my interest. But I'll read you an excerpt of the letter, and I quote, "During our talks, we have had a very fruitful exchange of views on the international situation in general, placing particular emphasis on Asia, as well as the opportunity of reviewing our bilateral relations as both of our countries face a new era. I am confident that through these talks, we have been able not only to place our bilateral relations on an even firmer basis than heretofore, but we have also succeeded in contributing significantly to the cause of world peace. The words of the Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Sato. And so on these notes and with these reflections, I want to extend our thanks to our three panelists, the professors, Dick Allen. Thank you for participating in today's panel. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure to be able to lead this discussion, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you.
Let's thank our panelists again. And ladies and gentlemen, you are released for the next 20 minutes to get some coffee, refresh, and we'll meet you back here at 12 noon as we start our second panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're about to begin the next phase of our program. There's a great buzz in this room. I'm really happy to see everybody back after 15 months. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to begin our second panel discussion, the future of the Senkaku Islands and U.S. commitments in the region, where we're going to talk about the U.S.-Japan relationship over the next, well, since the reversion of Okinawa, and then looking forward into the next 50 years. To kick off our next panel, it is my pleasure to introduce our program moderator, Kimberly Reed, who was the first woman to serve as the chairman of the board of directors, president and CEO of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, the nation's official $135 billion export credit agency, where she helped U.S. companies succeed in the competitive global marketplace. She is a Council on Competitiveness Distinguished Fellow and a member of the Nixon Seminar, serves on the Hudson Institute's Hamilton Commission on Securing America's National Security Innovation Base, the American Swiss Foundation Board of Directors, and Indiana University School of Public Health Dean's Alliance. She is the recipient of the U.S. Department of Defense's highest civilian award, the Medal for Distinguished Public Service. She previously served as president of the International Food Information Council Foundation, senior advisor to U.S. Treasury Secretaries John Snow and Henry Paulson, and Vice President for Financial Markets Policy Relations at Lehman Brothers. Would you please join me in welcoming Kimberly Reed?
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's so nice to be with you today. I'm very honored to be moderating a panel on the future of the Senkaku Islands and U.S. commitment in the region. Before I begin, I just want to say on a personal note, for those who may be watching virtually, we are at the beautiful Nixon Library in the East Room, and it is an exact replica, except larger, of the East Room at the White House. And I know that we have 200 people participating today in person and virtually, and I know that this video of our day today will be made available. As a young person, I first visited the Nixon Library in 1991, and I can't tell you what an honor it is to be back again. Back in the year 2008, I first met Christopher Nixon Cox and his wonderful father, Ed Cox. We worked together on the McCain campaign. And I learned a lot of great lessons from both of you that I know that you're also bringing forward from lessons that you learned from your grandfather. That was a wonderful opportunity. And then growing up professionally in Washington, Professor Nichter mentioned the Nixon recordings. I listened to C-SPAN radio. I'm a C-SPAN junkie. And I will say that although President Nixon would not be viewed as my grandfather, as Professor Nichter said for his own daughter through the hearing of those great lessons. I can't tell you that how he has helped shape me as a professional from those wonderful tapes and what you learned from them and what we're discussing here today. I'm so excited to be with such distinguished people today, and I know that Ambassador Tomita will be joining us shortly. As the head of the Export-Import Bank, I just concluded my term by law in January, but I had the great opportunity of working with counterparts in Japan. There are two export credit agencies in Japan, the Nippon Export and Investment Insurance and the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, also known as NEXI and JBIC. And I was so honored to have Ambassador Robert O'Brien invite me to accompany him to something called the East Asia Summit in 2019, where we sat in a room where I watched Ambassador O'Brien engage directly with Prime Minister Abe. And I had the opportunity as part of that wonderful event to sign a co-financing reciprocal agreement with NEXI. And then with JBIC, I had the wonderful opportunity to advance cooperation with them and with the Japanese on looking at advanced nuclear energy. So that brings me to something else I would like to say. I hope for those of you who are not members of the Nixon Foundation and the Nixon Library, I think this is an excellent example of the wonderful programming and intellectual stimulation that you can get being a part of discussions like this. So I highly encourage you to do that. Also, Ambassador O'Brien previously mentioned that the Nixon Foundation is sponsoring something called the Nixon Seminar. I am a member of that, and we gather monthly to talk about a key topic, along with Ambassador O'Brien as Secretary Pompeo, and one of the ex officio members is Secretary Kissinger. And we will be hearing shortly also from one of the participants of that seminar, Mary Kissel. But this past month, we focused in on what we're talking about today, Japan-U.S. relations. And during that seminar, I shared a quote, and I'd like to share that with you today from the President's 1978 memoirs. Many Americans were primarily Europeanist in their approach to foreign affairs, dismissing Asia as relatively unimportant. But United States is a Pacific power, and rapid changes were taking place in Asia, where more than half the human race lived, that might well determine the world's future. Japan would soon be the world's third-ranking industrial power behind the United States and the Soviet Union. Some of the most rapid rates of economic progress anywhere were being achieved by nations of non-communist Asia. And mainland China potentially posed to be the greatest threat to peace during the final third of the 20th century. So that was President Nixon back in 1978. And that brings me to what we're going to be talking about today. Any discussion of the future of U.S.-Japan relations must include a discussion of the Senkaku Islands. We've just heard a fantastic overview of the reversion of Okinawa and why the Nixon administration felt it was time to reorient America's commitments in the region, pivot to the Pacific, and strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance. With that, I'd now like to call forward our panelists. So, in person, we will be having Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who was the 28th National Security Advisor, serving from 2019 to 2021. He previously served as the Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs and as a U.S. representative to the UN General Assembly. Ambassador O'Brien has practiced law for 30 years in Los Angeles and has rejoined the firm he founded with Judge Stephen Larson's LLP of counsel. We also have in person Mary Kissel, who is Executive Vice President and Senior Policy Advisor at Stevens Incorporated, who served as the Senior Advisor to Secretary of State Michael R. Pompeo. She was a member of the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and hosted Foreign Edition, the editorial page's foreign policy podcast. She was the Wall Street Journal's Asian opinion editor from 2005 to 2010. Previously, she worked at Goldman Sachs in New York and London. And virtually, we have Dr. Michael Oslin, who is the Payson G. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow in Contemporary Asia at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. A historian by training, he specializes in U.S. policy in Asia and geopolitical issues in the Indo-Pacific region. And also we have Mitake Kamiya, who is a professor of international relations at the National Defense Academy of Japan, a distinguished research fellow at the Japan Forum on International Relations, or JFIR, and is adjunct research fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. He is the leader of the JFIR Carnegie Endowment project called China Risk and China Opportunity for the U.S.-Japan Alliance. And as our panelists take their stage, if you would be interested in learning a more complete and lengthy history of Japan and U.S. relations, I would recommend a book by Michael Green of CSIS called By More Than Providence, Grand Strategy and American Power in the Asian Pacific Since 1783. So with that, I'll call forward our panelists. Okay, so let's start with Dr. Oslin. Dr. Oslin, you're a trained historian. Can you expand a bit upon what the ambassador just said on administrative rights? Hold on one second. Okay, we're going to start again. Matake, I'd like to begin with you. And I wonder if you can take us on a brief trip through time to explain the Senkaku Island dispute from the point of the reversion of Okinawa to now.
Okay, thank you very much, Kimberly. I'm Matake Kamiya, Professor of International Relations at National Defense Academy of Japan. I, first of all, would like to express my deepest appreciation for Nixon Foundation for inviting me to this important panel. Although I'm prevented to be there at the Nixon Library in person because of the COVID-19, I'm still very happy to be on this panel now. With regard to the Senkaku issue, the brief history is like this. I mean, China's challenge to Japan's sovereignty of the Senkaku Islands represents a part of China's wider attempt to challenge the existing rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific and globally. Let me explain why by giving some basic historical facts briefly about the Senkaku Islands. And first, most important fact is, these islands had never been a part of any country before Japan incorporated them into its territory in the late 19th century. And when Japan incorporated the second Senkaku Islands into the territory, Japan did so in accordance with the ways of duly acquiring territorial sovereignty under international law. This is another important fact with regard to the Senkaku Islands. Historically, the Senkaku Islands were uninhibited, I said. From 1885 through 1895, the government of Japan conducted an investigation on the sovereignty situation on the Senkaku Islands. And after it was confirmed that they didn't belong to anybody, Japan declared in 1895 that the islands were incorporated into Japan's territory, part of Okinawa Prefecture. And Japan's incorporation of the Senkaku Islands was never challenged by any country for over 70 years after that. That is third important fact about the Senkakus. Japanese people subsequently settled on the islands and conducted business activities such as collecting albatross feathers and manufacturing dried bonito or katsuobushi, one of the most essential ingredients for Japanese cooking, as you know. And after 1940, the islands became uninhibited again. After the World War II, the islands were placed under the administration of the United States as part of Okinawa under the San Francisco Peace Treaty of 1951. The US administered the Senkaku Islands until 1972, when Okinawa was returned to Japan. And during those years, the US military set up shooting ranges on 2 islands on Senkakus and did the exercises. China made any challenges to the US administration of Senkaku Islands until 1971. On the contrary, prior to that year, China consistently acknowledged the Senkakus were part of the territory of Japan. For example, China's People's Daily CCP's newspaper, published an article on January 8, 1953, titled "The Battle of People in Ryukyu Islands to Oppose the US Occupation." That article described the Senkaku Islands as part of Japan's Ryukyu Islands occupied by the United States. By the way, Ryukyu is, of course, Okinawa. The situation changed after the United Nations Agency published a report in 1968 that identified the potential for enormous deposits of oil and natural gas resources near the Senkaku Islands at the bottom of East China Sea. China began claiming the territorial rights of the islands in 1971. These facts clearly shows that China's territorial claim over the Senkaku Islands is groundless and against the international laws and rules. That is why I said at the beginning that China's challenge to Japan's sovereignty of the Senkaku Islands represents a part of China's wider attempt to challenge the existing rules-based international order in the Indo-Pacific and globally. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Ambassador O'Brien, as you mentioned in your remarks this morning, the Trump administration in which you served made it a major priority to engage Japan as a check against the People's Republic of China. But even friends don't always see things eye to eye, and there remains a question of who really owns or who has sovereignty over the Senkaku Islands. What is the American position now?
So as Professor Mataki pointed out, there had been no real challenge to Japanese sovereignty over the Senkakus or U.S. administration of the Senkakus post-World War II by the PRC until somewhat recently. And what's happened more recently over the past decade or two, China has rolled out its strategy of using its maritime militia or its blue militia as it is done in the South China Sea to attempt to wrest sovereignty of the Senkakus from Japan. We saw very similar efforts that they've used in the South China Sea, where they'll swarm the islands with large numbers of fishing trawlers, sometimes interspersed with Chinese Coast Guard vessels, in an attempt to muscle their way in, take the islands, and push the government that has sovereignty over those islands out. Now that worked with Vietnam, it worked with the Philippines and some of our other friends in the South China Sea. I think they made a mistake and underestimated the situation in the Senkakus when they had started to attempt to do this, especially in the early aughts, the 2000 to 2010, 12 time period. And there were three factors that they underestimated, or that they as President Bush used to say, misunderestimated. And number one was the capability and the professionalism of the Japanese Coast Guard. So unlike some of our other allies in the South China Sea, Japan did not allow this blue militia, these trawlers, to simply come in and impose their will on the Senkakus and wrest them from Japan. The Japanese Coast Guard sorted out on regular occasions. They pushed the Chinese out of their territorial waters, and they did so in a highly professional manner, although there were a number of relatively dangerous encounters that you can see on YouTube of Chinese and Japanese Coast Guard ships going hull to hull, firing water hoses at each other and that sort of thing. But the capability of the Japanese Coast Guard was one factor. The second factor is the Chinese underestimated the political will in Japan. And so, especially with Prime Minister Abe and now with Prime Minister Suga, you have very strong leaders who have a strong political base in the country that represent the popular desire of the people of Japan to maintain sovereignty over the Senkakus, and neither of them bend. I mean, they're both they both have iron in their spines when it comes to the Senkakus. And number three, China underestimated the willingness of the United States to stand up for its ally Japan. They didn't understand the strength of the mutual defense treaty between the United States and Japan and the U.S.'s commitment to Japan. So even in the Obama administration, and this is at a time which I think probably really surprised China when we were leading from behind and exercising strategic patience and all the things we did away with in the Trump administration. In April 2014, President Obama came out and expressly stated that Article 5 of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and Japan covered the Senkaku Islands. And I think that was a bit of a shock to the Chinese. They saw, they didn't see that sort of resoluteness in other parts of the world in that administration, but they saw it with Japan. I think that shows the continuity of the relationship between the U.S. and Japan across different administrations, even when the approach to foreign policy is very different. Certainly in the Trump administration, we took the position that Article 5 applied and that we supported Japan's sovereignty over the Senkakus. And then I think the Chinese were again surprised when President-elect Joe Biden at the time in November of 2020, after he was elected, came out and said that Article 5 applies to the Senkakus. So you have a situation where the U.S. has made it very clear across administrations with very different foreign policy profiles that the Senkakus are part of Japan, that the Mutual Defense Treaty applies to any attempt to wrest the Senkakus away from Japan. And so I think between the professionalism of the Japanese Maritime Forces, Coast Guard, and Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, the iron will of the two most recent prime ministers, Abe and Suga of Japan, and the support of the United States across both Republican and Democrat administrations, I think that's the difference that you have in the Senkakus and the South China Sea.
Thank you. Now to Dr. Oslin. You're a trained historian. Can you expand a bit upon what the ambassador just said? Administrative rights are different from sovereignty. Why account for such a difference?
First, I'm glad you gave me time to think about it beforehand, so thank you. Let me also say thank you for letting me join and for holding this event. And I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., so I wish I was with you, but very glad to be able to dial in for this. Look, first, I think Professor Kamiya and Ambassador O'Brien laid it out extremely clearly. There's actually little to add except maybe some of the context. I think the history that Professor Kamiya stated is, of course, it's contested and it would be disputed by China, but it's very clear. And the policy responses that we've seen now going on past a decade on the part of Japan that Ambassador O'Brien talked about are very, very clear. In international diplomacy, there's all sorts of different stratagems one takes to get desired ends without necessarily having to use all the means at one's disposal to achieve them. So, for example, the differences you're asking between sovereignty and between administration. Well, if possession is 9/10 of the law, then by stating that something is administered by a country in the sense of a dispute, it's an informal, de facto, unofficial way of saying we don't want to get fully involved in the legal issues, but we recognize that this is the territory of country X. And that's what we did with the Senkakus, because of course, as Professor Kamiya said, they'd been under Japanese control for well over 100 years. Or roughly 100 years by the time of the reversion. We had controlled them after World War II for 30 years, and then we were turning them back over to Japan. What's interesting, I think, is when you look at the issue of China, what it did was really serve as a forcing function. And Ambassador O'Brien just mentioned that it wasn't until China began making its claims and then trying to act on those claims, forcing Japan to defend the islands with the very capable Japanese Coast Guard, that the United States for the first time was actually forced to clarify some of the provisions of Article 5. It was what we call, in reference to Taiwan, strategic ambiguity, but it was ambiguous because there had never been a challenge. The challenge came when China became capable, and that, I think, is the lesson. The lesson isn't what international law is, because that can be disputed, challenged, overturned at any time, unfortunately. It isn't what tradition is, because tradition can also be overturned at any time. It's what any state at a given point in time feels capable of doing and shows that it's capable of doing, actually then becomes the forcing function to determine what your policy is. In other words, from 1945 until, let's say, 2010, there was no challenge security-wise to the islands. We could say, in essence, whatever we wanted, and it didn't matter because no one had the ability to change the status quo. In 2010, because of questions over nationalization of the islands and Tokyo taking them over from their private owner, this became the issue that China now disputed. That, I think, is the lesson, and it ties back to what Professor Kamiya was saying earlier, about China trying to change rules, change norms, change patterns of behavior. And because Japan did not do what many other nations do, and here we're thinking of some other allies of the United States in the Pacific, they held steadfast and forthright in defending their claims and building up the military that they needed to defend those.
Thank you very much. Professor Kamiya, just building on that a little bit, can you again state what is the Japanese position on the islands and what informs such a position?
Well, the Japanese position to the islands are very clear. It has been the Japanese territory since the 1895, and before that, it belonged to nobody. It didn't belong to anybody. And therefore, I mean, you use the term, you Americans often use the term Senkaku dispute or territorial dispute surrounding Senkaku Islands, but the Japanese government refused to call it the dispute because if it is called the dispute, any country can make a new claim to anybody's territory and start to call it a dispute. That's unfair. That's Japanese position. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mary Kissel, you served with Secretary Pompeo at the State Department. You saw firsthand how America began to harden against the People's Republic of China over the last 4 years, egged on by the PRC's myriad abuses of the international rules-based order. The U.S. and Japan signed a defense treaty after the end of World War II, but considering the growing threat that China poses in the region, should the limits that exist on Japan's ability to defend herself and rearm be reconsidered?
Thank you for the easiest question that's been asked so far. And thank you to the Nixon Library and to all of you for being here. It's a great honor and privilege to be on such a distinguished panel. Before I answer that question, I might just take a step back and ask, why are the Senkaku Islands important? Why are we talking about them? And why do we continue to talk about them? And one of the panelists alluded to this earlier. We're talking about them not just because of the energy resources, but because of their strategic location. They're the gateway to East Asia. And so I won't call it the People's Republic of China because it does not represent the people of China. Let's call it Communist China. But Communist China has engaged, as the ambassador said, in a strategy of trying to change the strategic balance in Asia by simply surrounding, claiming, or building property. And you saw that during the Obama administration, building islands in the South China Sea. But you see a different level today when they're surrounding the sovereign territory of the Philippines, and where we've had more than 120 daily incursions around the Senkaku Islands. So that's why we care and we're having this discussion. Why do we continue to have this discussion? Because China is not free and it's not democratic. And whereas it would be perhaps easier to ameliorate or even to resolve this dispute with a free and democratic country, unfortunately we don't have that privilege today, although hopefully we'll have it someday in the future. So should the U.S.-Japan relationship change? Is this your question, Kimberly? Should we have a different balance in the relationship? I think we have a balance exactly right today. I think the Japanese Coast Guard is perfectly capable of dealing with these incursions. I think, if anything, it would be incumbent on the United States to speak out and to highlight the challenges to Japanese sovereignty. In fact, it was just after President Biden took office that Communist China decided to give their Coast Guard new powers, almost military-like powers, to enforce what they see as their new claims on places like the Senkakus, but you could also see it in the Spratlys and the Paracels and in other parts of Asia. So I think the balance is right today, but I think we need a new and heightened focus given the kinds of behaviors that we've seen from the so-called fishing boats from Communist China. Thank you.
Building on that a little bit, Mary, do you think that the Senkaku Islands are symbolic of this question of whether Japan should be taking on more of its own defense?
Right, the other easy question on the panel. Well, you know, the ability to build a strong defense always starts at home. And I think one of the great challenges that Japan faces today is its anemic economic growth. And so I think that is a limiting factor in the amount that they can deploy for their self-defense. Maybe I'll leave it at that. Okay. And we'll let the ambassador and others on the panel.
Let's turn to you now, Ambassador. How do you think Japan is approaching its relationship with not only the United States, but with the countries of the G7 right now, and will in the coming years? We've just finished the G7 summit in Cornwall. What's your analysis, and how do the islands factor into this?
Well, I think all the G7 countries are starting to awaken to the challenge of the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party, and I think that's one of the legacies of the Trump administration that historians are going to write about 50 years from now. That a bipartisan consensus developed in the United States regarding the challenge presented by China, and that consensus is now spreading out to the G7. Now, this is something that we didn't need to teach the Japanese. They've understood the assertive nature of the Communist Party of China. They've understood the assaults on their own territory with the efforts to wrest the Senkakus from them. Certain Chinese thought leaders are even talking about Okinawa as being part of China that should be turned over to the Communist Party. So I think the Chinese or the Japanese have woken up to this threat. I think the G7 has taken a little more time. I think there are countries in the G7 that are very aware of the threat, and even countries in the G20. I think of India, which was viciously attacked. One of its patrols was viciously attacked in the line of actual control last fall by the Chinese People's Liberation Army. And the soldiers were terribly treated, and those who were killed were mutilated and thrown off crevasses. And that woke up, once the Indian tabloids got a hold of that, it was something the Indian government couldn't downplay. And there was a sea change that you had in India on views towards China. 150 apps, popular apps, including TikTok and others, were banned in India. And so I think the world, the G7, the G20, and certainly here domestically, is waking to the challenge that's being presented by China, as the professors pointed out, as Michael's pointed out, efforts to change the rules-based international order, but not just the rules-based order, it's just to literally conquer territory. So, extinguishing democracy in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, threatening and bullying Taiwan, the dispute with India, obviously Tibet has long been an issue for people that care about human rights, the situation in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs. So this is a very assertive effort, and the Senkakus are just one part of a greater effort of China to expand its territorial reach through some, even through conquest, which was something that at least for 100 years most governments haven't viewed as an appropriate way to achieve territorial expansion. It was once something that was illegal under international law. It's not something that, after the UN Charter, is considered a kosher way to expand your state. And yet we see that with the Chinese. What the Japanese could do, though, they have a large military. They have a very large economy. They spend about 1% of their GDP on the economy. They're up against a foe that's much bigger, that has a bigger economy, that's spending upwards of, when you factor in real numbers and purchasing power parity and that sort of thing, probably 3 to 4% of their GDP on the most massive peacetime military buildup the world's ever seen in the People's Republic of China. Japan has to do some things to increase its defense spending. We can't just rely. The United States no longer has an overmatch capability to deal with China without the help of our allies, and so Japan is going to have to step up. One of the easiest things they can do, Japan makes a very capable diesel-electric submarine called the Soyuz-class submarine. They retire them after about 20 years. The subs could probably go 40 years. I mean, I know people still driving their Toyotas and Hondas like 50 years out. Never even changed the oil. So, everyone likes a new car. The Japanese Navy likes a new submarine every 20 years. If they would just extend the service life of their current subs 5 to 7 years as the new ones come on board, they could increase their submarine force by about a third very quickly. And that would have a tremendous impact on the balance in the naval balance in the Asia-Pacific region. So there are things the Japanese can do without spending a lot more money, but with a little bit more dedication to their defenses. And one thing we all learned through President Reagan, peace through strength works, and we could use a little bit of an extra helping hand from the Japanese. I'm not talking about 3 or 4% of the GDP like we spend or like the Chinese are spending, but even getting up to that 2% range like our NATO allies have committed to doing would make a big difference in Indo-Pacific and help us share. It would help share the burden of confronting an aggressive China in the Western Pacific.
Thank you. Just a little sidetrack, but back to the G7, for those who did not follow the outcomes document closely. If you could just share with the audience, Ambassador, the significance of the word Taiwan appearing in this document.
Well, look, I think the world is starting to become very concerned about the bullying of Taiwan. Taiwan has been bullied. The Chinese have stated that they will get their one country two systems, or reunification, or onslaught would be another word for it, with Taiwan, one way or the other. But no one really assumed that there would be a cross-strait amphibious invasion of Taiwan. But when you look at the calculations that have been made in Hong Kong and other places by the Chinese Communist Party, I think there's a real concern that's growing around the world that China might actually attempt to alter the situation with Taiwan by military force sooner rather than later. And I think part of that calculation is the Taiwanese, after watching what happened in Hong Kong, they realized that the one country, two systems is a lie. That China extinguished democracy in Hong Kong. And so any thought that the Taiwanese would voluntarily reunify with China anytime soon is out the window. The people of Taiwan want nothing to do with the Chinese Communist Party. And so the Chinese, I think, are now looking at their other options, and one of those would be military force. It's concerning to not just the United States, but to our allies in Europe and around the Pacific. And so I think the reference to Taiwan was an effort to bolster the status of Taiwan and discourage the Chinese from launching some sort of cross-strait invasion of Taiwan.
Thank you. Dr. Oslin, as a student of history, you know that Japan relied on the United States for many years after World War II. But the miracle of Japan took hold. And by the 1980s, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. It's now the third, displaced only by China's recent growth. Is the United States starting to rely on Japan more than it did in the previous century? What do you think about that dynamic?
I think it is, but I think it is because Japan is ready to take on more responsibilities. Actually, this goes back in terms of Japan beginning to expand its security partnership and cooperation with the United States to the 1980s and the fabled relationship between President Reagan and Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone, the so-called Ran-Yasu relationship that began to bring Japan out of that post-World War II set of self-imposed restrictions. Now, it is true that Japan already takes on itself the burden of the bulk of its own defense. So, I mean, if Japan were attacked, the frontline troops would be the Japanese self-defense forces, the maritime self-defense forces, and the air self-defense forces. It would not be United States troops. Now, we would be there to help in many ways, but Japan has an extraordinarily well-trained and well-equipped military. What you saw in the past decade under Prime Minister Abe, without everyone focuses on constitutional revision, and he did not revise the Constitution, but he really doesn't or didn't need to, because what he did was remove almost all of the other restrictions on Japan's participation in security cooperation, collective self-defense with allies, joint production of munitions and exporting them abroad, information sharing, getting closer in terms of intelligence sharing with the United States, not at the Five Eyes level, but closer than it had been. And the recapitalization of the self-defense forces. Japan now has two extremely large helicopter carriers that could be converted for F-35Bs to turn them into helicopter carriers. They will be the world's second largest procurer of F-35s. As Ambassador O'Brien said, they have a submarine force that is top notch. We shouldn't forget, of course, that during the Cold War, it was Japan's ability in anti-submarine warfare that really allowed the US Navy to keep the Soviet Navy bottled up in the bastions in Kamchatka and other areas in Siberia. And that's a capability that can be brought back online. So the answer to your question is we rely on Japan more because Japan's doing more, because it's been changing its policies, but also putting meat on the bones. Now, I'm going to do something I never, ever do, and I'm very scared to do, which is slightly disagree with Mary Kissel. I never do that, but I'm going to do it here just for a second, which is to say that I think that while Japan has a very capable Coast Guard, and I've mentioned that, the Chinese strategy is to wear down opponents. It's to wear them down politically, ideologically, economically, as it's trying to do against Australia, but also from the military angle. And that's what it's been doing in the Senkakus for over a decade. It's what it does to Taiwan. And just this week, we saw 28 PLAAF jets go into or near Taiwanese airspace. So the problem is not that Japan doesn't have a great Coast Guard and a great Navy, it does, but that after a decade of both the Navy, the Maritime Self-Defense Forces and the Air Force scrambling and responding to Chinese provocations and interventions into the waters and skies around the Senkakus and other areas, it begins to wear down your military. So I agree with Ambassador O'Brien that Japan needs, as it's done, to be thinking about that long game and the long term of maintaining the capabilities. And then we have to be thinking how we can help with that more directly, and possibly bringing in other actors like the Quad or a Quad Plus. Japan and Britain are getting very close. Obviously, Australia and India are close allies. It's not just about the US and Japan anymore. Japan is working with a lot of different actors, a lot of different partners, and we should be part of that and helping to expand it.
Thank you very much. Mary, I know you want to respond to that, but let me just also add in, is this dispute over sovereignty of the islands one that threatens the rules-based order internationally? And if so, how do we solve that? Who enforces international law?
Yes, it does threaten the rules-based order. And actually, it should be fine for Michael to disagree with me. I hired him 15 years ago to write for the Wall Street Journal Asia editorial page. So thank you very much. And I'm glad also that he raised the Quad. Two points in response. Firstly, I would never underestimate the will of the Japanese people to defend their sovereign territory. So I actually have great confidence that were the Senkakus really threatened, and they are threatened today, that the Japanese Coast Guard and other elements would be brought to bear in full force. Secondly, on the Quad, I was present at the first foreign minister meeting of the Quad at the UN General Assembly in 2019, and it was quite an extraordinary event. The Quad, of course, was born during the Bush years, but it was revivified under the Trump administration. And there was actually some hesitancy at that time between the four foreign ministers, particularly India, to come out and to be seen together, to take a photograph with the press corps coming in, and to actually publicly express concern with what was happening with communist China. But only a year later, Japan and the government of Japan was so concerned about what had happened with COVID and the pandemic and the kinds of provocations that Ambassador O'Brien laid out, that they actually gave us a special dispensation to fly into Tokyo to have an in-person foreign minister meeting. And I think that speaks to the role that Misha just laid out of the steps that Prime Minister Abe and Suga have taken to expand their capabilities. But it also speaks of their willingness to start to form a kind of informal alliance in Asia, between Asia's democracies, that would serve them very well if indeed we did get to that day where you had, God forbid, a challenge to Taiwan or the Senkaku Islands or some of the other areas where we see in particular the PLA Navy acting so aggressively. So I guess I'm a bit more optimistic, although I would absolutely love more defense spending. Who wouldn't love that? I'd love a more vigorous Japanese economy to give them more space to do that. But I think in particular this alliance structure that we're seeing really in its nascent stages is deeply encouraging. As for the rules-based international order, that's another phrase that I don't like, because someone has to enforce rules for them to matter. And what we saw with Communist China's claim to parts of the South China Sea, they were arbitrated by the International Panel of Arbitration, and then completely ignored. So who cares? If we can't enforce these rules and norms and practices, then they don't matter, and might will make right. And so I think the more that we can encourage freedom, the democratization of Asia Pacific, and the more cooperation that we can achieve between those democracies, the safer we'll all be.
Thank you. Ambassador Brian, I know that we had the great honor of going together to Yokota Air Base. I've actually visited it twice in Japan, and you are a big champion of the national security strategy of economic security as national security, and our partners around the world appreciate that as well, and all of your great work. Let's just do a hypothetical. What would happen if China seized the Senkakus and we, the United States, did nothing?
So now that I'm out of office, I guess I could answer hypotheticals. I used to always say, especially on the Sunday shows, I'll never answer a hypothetical question. But now I guess I've lost that excuse. But look, one of the things that the United States has is we have tremendous tools in foreign policy and national security, and they range the gamut from diplomatic tools, and we would certainly, I'm sure, move to isolate the Chinese further than they already have been. Economically, we're somewhat intertwined with the supply chain in China, but I think you're starting to slowly see the supply chain move out of China. We're seeing a lot of companies that are moving not just back and onshoring to the U.S., but nearshoring and going to places like Vietnam and the Philippines. And not just U.S. companies, but Japanese companies, German companies, realizing that the prospect of an invasion of the Senkakus or Taiwan could occur. And if that happens, those companies would be caught flat-footed if their supply chain rested in China. So I think they're taking a long-term view and starting to make provisions for that contingency. So I think there'd be severe economic sanctions. And then on the military front, we still are, we don't have the total dominance that we had after the end of the Cold War, but we're still a pretty effective fighting force. The United States has been fighting since our inception, and with one exception, we've done pretty well. And as going back to the Princess Bride, we don't want another land war in Asia, but we certainly have a lot of tools. The United States Navy is very capable, both at the surface level with naval aviators and at the subsurface level, that should give the Chinese, the PLA Navy and the PLA Air Force real reason to pause before they engage in territorial conquest with an ally like Japan, or even if they attempted to conquer Taiwan. And as Mary pointed out, I think one of the facts of life for the future for the Chinese is the Quad. The Quad is becoming very capable, it's becoming very integrated at the National Security Advisor level, at the Foreign Ministry level, but also at the Defense Minister and Defense Secretary level. And when you put India and Australia and Japan and the United States together, that's a very formidable combination across the spectrum, from diplomatic to economic to military. So I think the PLA needs to think very carefully before they engage in a war of conquest, whether it be Taiwan or the Senkakus or anywhere else in the Indo-Pacific region, because they will face adversaries with capabilities that meet or exceed their own.
Building on Mary's comment at the start, I just also want to underscore that half of all shipping goes through the East China Sea. So when we talk about what's important to the United States and our supply chain, very, very important. Okay, so you don't want another hypothetical, so I'll give you one, okay? Hypothetical. So we're right now. I want to just say we most recently served with former ambassador, now Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee. He was our last United States ambassador to Japan. And if you look in the press, no announcement has been made, but you will see speculation in the press that perhaps Mayor Rahm Emanuel will be named by President Biden as the nominee to be the next ambassador to Japan. Again, that's only in the press. And so Senator Hagerty now sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee, which will have the hearing for that nominee to be the next ambassador to Japan. And so, hypothetical question. What would happen if the U.S. would call upon Japan to compromise with China?
Why am I getting all of these questions? I don't think it'll happen because I think that the bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill that recognizes the nature of the communist regime and appreciates the threat that it poses to not just the United States, but the rest of the free world, is very secure. And I agree with Ambassador O'Brien. I think it will be one of the seminal foreign policy achievements of the Trump administration. And in fact, when you look across the public sphere or the private sphere in America, most everyone has woken up, with the exception, perhaps, of the industry that I work in, which is Wall Street. Although, thankfully, not my employer, Stevens Inc., which is a great American institution that does not do business with communist China. So in the hypothetical situation, I don't think that it will occur. I think, if anything, you'll see attitudes harden. You've seen them start to harden in Europe. North Asia has long been aware of the threat, the people of Taiwan, and unfortunately now the voiceless people of Hong Kong know it well. And in fact, I think Jimmy Lai, the proprietor of Apple Daily, before he was locked up, said it well. He was asked, why are you advocating, why are you speaking out against what's going on in the mainland? You've made a lot of money, you could go anywhere in the world, do anything, live very safely and securely, enjoy life with your family in your retirement. And he said, I'm speaking out because what is happening with us is going to happen to you. And so, when you see that kind of courage, that kind of resolve from a man like that, and you see the people of Taiwan and the way that they've voted and the way that they've rejected Communist China's overtures, the great people of Japan, who have long warned us of these problems, and the awakening that's going on in Europe and the United States, I think we're at a real turning point in our history. And the question isn't also what we do, it's also what Beijing chooses to do. So some of this is within our control, but some of it is not. But I think it's very encouraging, as Ambassador O'Brien said, that the continuity of our relationship with Japan has lasted across Republican and Democrat administrations, and that this awakening that we see to the communist threat is only growing.
One final question as we conclude. I'd like to go around to each of our distinguished panelists to talk about solutions to these challenges. What policy advice would you give to President Biden, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Secretary Blinken, and Prime Minister Suga Maki? Professor Kamiya, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Dr. Oslin, and then to Mary Kissel, and close with Ambassador O'Brien.
Okay, I was muted. Oops. The answer is simple but difficult. I mean, the most important thing is to maintain a close cooperation among the liberal democracies, and the US-Japan alliance should be the core of that coalition of liberal rules-based liberal democracies. Well, probably we shouldn't limit coalitions with to the liberal democracies, but also the wider like-minded countries, and that could include many of the Southeast Asian countries, and even countries like some countries in Africa or some countries in Latin America and those places. But anyway, we have to unite together to protect and maintain the. Although Mary didn't like the words, I like the word liberal rules-based international order or free and open rules-based international order. We here, I mean, United States and Japan, lived in that order quite comfortably for many decades. Now it is challenged. And if we want to continue our comfortable lives, we have to protect that order, whatever you call it. And in order to defend the order, as Mary mentioned, rules have to be enforced by somebody's power. And the most important power to protect the existing rules of international society, international community, is the power of US-Japan alliance. But now that's not sufficient. We have to extend our coalition to Quad Plus, or even wider international community who share the idea that the free, open system, free and open order is better than authoritative order. And in other words, order supported by US and Japan are better than the order supported by China and like-minded country to China. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Aslam?
Well, I think history shows that you have to live with the choices you made. And in terms of the alliance with Japan, we made a good choice in terms of the ways in which we did not take the China challenge and threat seriously. We made a bad choice. So I think we've been doing the right thing. We've been doing the right thing for a long time, but conditions have changed and the environment's changed. You know, the fact that when the risk was much lower in the South China Sea, let's say, we didn't do anything to deter China. We now are in a much riskier environment, both in terms of trying to affect a return to what it was before in the South China Sea, or simply in trying to divert China. If you asked someone 12 years ago or so, whether they thought China would make a move on the Senkakus, the answer probably would have been yes. But because Japan was very steadfast, because the United States was steadfast, it's still essentially the status quo that it's been. So I think that's what we need to keep doing, but you have to always keep bettering what you're doing, you know, and so we've all talked about increasing the military spending. We've talked about finding new partners. We've talked about being more inventive, whether it's using Quad or other mechanisms. That's really what we need to do until the Chinese determine that this is a losing game for them. Right now, they don't necessarily think that. They may think time is on their side. In another 10 years, that may have changed, better for worse, hopefully for the better on our end, because we've done everything we need to do to keep this a credible deterrent.
Mary Kissel.
I think I might, if I were still working for Secretary Pompeo, I'd say we need to think more foundationally. We need to remember who we are. We're two of the world's great peoples, great democracies. No other nation in the history of the world was founded on the idea that individuals have rights and that we give those rights to government, our unalienable rights. And that makes us very special, and it makes us special partners. We also, secondarily, have to remember who Communist China is. They are not the people of China. They are the true communist regime. They thought they were more communist than the Soviets. We simply didn't take their word for that. And we need to understand them in that way. And because of those two things, we cannot show weakness. Weakness will invite conflict. And so whether it's the Senkakus, whether it's Taiwan, or anywhere else in the world where countries like ours are challenged by regimes like theirs, that's the one thing we cannot afford to do, is to show weakness.
Thank you. Ambassador Bryan.
Well, thank you. So Mitaki and Michael and Mary, that was very eloquent. Certainly it's great counsel for Secretary Blinken, or National Security Advisor Sullivan, and President Biden. Let me just, and I wouldn't be presumptuous enough to offer advice to Jake or to Tony. Let me do something that's a little counterintuitive. I want to commend Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken and President Biden for maintaining for the most part, maintaining the Trump policy on China by continuing to emphasize the Quad. We could do a little bit better on military spending. It was an increase, but with inflation, it's a little bit of a decrease. But for maintaining the military budget and for taking a strong position on human rights when it comes to China. So I think I think the proof is in the pudding of what we're seeing now is that the Trump policies, the Trump administration policies on China are durable, and I commend the new administration for continuing those policies for the most part. Let me just pick up on something that Mary said. I've said this many times. In international relations, weakness is provocative. It's a little counterintuitive. People think that if you turn the other cheek and you show weakness to your opponents when you're dealing with a very determined, committed communist adversary, that weakness is provocative. And even the perception of weakness is provocative. So even if the Trump administration, the policies of the past 4 years are continued by the new administration, doing so in a way that our adversaries can perceive as being less than confident or weak, may accidentally invite provocative action that then puts us in some sort of military clash. Peace through strength that Ronald Reagan talked about, that Richard Nixon believed in when you read The Real War, his book, and that all the candidates were carrying around in 1980, at least the Republican candidates. They understand that peace through strength works. So we've got to maintain a credible deterrence through our military budget. We've got to be credible on the economic front. We've got to be credible on the diplomatic front, and show our adversaries, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's Iran, that the United States is fundamentally strong. That we have issues that arise here from time to time, but as Mary mentioned, we have the foundational strength of knowing that we're governed by the people of the United States, and the principles that underlie our military, economic, and diplomatic power. It's the strength of freedom, and so we need to avoid showing any sort of weakness that would allow an adversary to miscalculate. So I'll leave it at that, but I do want to commend the new administration for continuing the policies of the Trump administration, those outlined by Secretary Pompeo and the President and our NSC team over the last 4 years.
So with that, let's thank our panel for this great discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Let's thank our panelists again, ladies and gentlemen, particularly Matake. I think it's 4:30 in the morning in Tokyo. So we're particularly grateful for having you with us, sir.
It's 5 a.m. now.
5 a.m. It's practically morning. I hope you're getting ready to have your coffee.
Thank you
all very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to break now, and we'll see you back here at 1:30 for lunch. I will ask you all to head out into the hallway for our reception, refresh, get a cup of coffee, a glass of water, because we do have to make some room for our catering team to come in and set down your meals. So we will see you back in this room at 1:30. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to acknowledge one special guest who's with us today, Mr. Ron Toyota of Metetsu Travel. Is Ron in here? There he is. Thank you for being here today, and we very much appreciate it. It's my pleasure to introduce a very special guest, member of the Board of Directors of the Richard Nixon Foundation, and a non-resident fellow at the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination at Princeton University. Perhaps most importantly, he is the eldest grandson of President and Mrs. Nixon. Please welcome Christopher Nixon Cox.
Thank you, Jim, for that introduction. And it's really a pleasure for me to be back here in person at the Richard Nixon Library. This is our first in-person event, so thank you all for being here today. It's really great to get things started again. Unfortunately, as you can tell, from the top up, I'm doing fine. From the bottom down, I'm still in COVID mode. I'm still in khaki mode and on vacation, so I'm used to the Zoom calls. But anyway, it's great to be it's great to be here with you all tonight, today. And this is just a wonderful event, and we're so thrilled to have the Japanese ambassador with us. We're so happy to have you here, and of course, our distinguished panelists. It's just been a really, really exciting day for me. And when I listen to all the history that we've heard, and then all of the future policy implications that that history has for the next 50 years in the Western Pacific, I took a moment to think a little bit about my grandfather. And Luke Nichter said it really well, that Richard Nixon was known for delivering a shock at times. And the China policy of Nixon to China became his signature policy. But that's only part of my grandfather's legacy. The other part of my grandfather's legacy is also of being really a consummate professional diplomat. And when I think of the best example of that, I think of my grandfather's long-term relationship with Japan. Of course, when my grandfather ran for Congress in 1946, right after the end of World War II, Japan was in a very sensitive spot in its history and in the history of the world. And my grandfather played such a critical role with the Japanese leaders in forging a new alliance and a new relationship with Japan. Because as we've seen with so much of the history that we've heard today, Japan plays such a critical role in the Western Pacific. And Richard Nixon, as a diplomat and a historian, recognized that role that Japan plays, and that Japan, historically with the Ryukyu Islands, going into Taiwan, with China, with Russia, Japan plays an incredibly important role, and he knew that. And so Richard Nixon set out from his early days in Congress to his days being vice president and into his presidency of forging personal relationships with Japanese leaders, with the people of Japan. This was something that was very important to him. And I think Jim Byron said it well. You can see how important Japan was to Richard Nixon by the fact that when he wrote his book, Leaders, he wrote about 10 leaders. And one of the leaders he picked was Shigeru Yoshida. And that was a seminal leader for him to write about that. Shigeru Yoshida was the prime minister of Japan right after World War II, and really helped reconstruct Japan and bring Japan into a close relationship with the United States. And that had great significance for Richard Nixon. And of course, when you take the history and go through then the development of the return of Okinawa, those 25 years, Richard Nixon really cemented the relationship between Japan and the United States. And it was a key part of how Richard Nixon was going to fight the Cold War against China and against Russia by bringing Japan into alliance with the United States. So always in Richard Nixon's mind was Japan, from his first days in Congress through the presidency. But maybe this is something you don't know, which was when my grandfather ultimately moved into his last house, he actually sold his house in Saddle River to a Japanese businessman. So it's a great bookend of his career, that he started off thinking about Japan, highlight with Okinawa, and then ultimately sold his house to a Japanese businessman. So it's just, Japan was always part of Richard Nixon. So today we're deeply honored to hear more about this relationship between Japan and the United States from His Excellency Koji Tomita, the ambassador of Japan to the United States. Ambassador Tomita joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1981, and has served as a key member of the Foreign Ministry for over 40 years. Most recently, he served in 3 senior positions as Japan's ambassador to Israel, to the G20 summit, and to South Korea, and has spent his career representing Japan across the Western world, including in posts in France and the United Kingdom. We're deeply honored to welcome him to the Nixon Library today, and this is actually his first trip to the West Coast of the United States. So let's give it, so on behalf of my family and colleagues and the board of directors of the Nixon Foundation, and from all of you today, let's give a hearty Southern California welcome to Ambassador Koji Tomita. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here at the Nixon Library. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this very important program. I took up my post back in January, a week after the inauguration, to be precise. And since then, I was feeling rather reticent going out of Washington because of the pandemic. But as things are getting back to normal, I'm starting to feel less constrained. So a few weeks ago, I ventured out of Washington and very cautiously went to the state of Indiana. And then I was invited by the state governor to watch the Indy 500 auto race. And I saw 140,000 people, almost without masks, enjoying themselves hugely. And I thought that things are getting back to normal. So I'm here today, with a great deal of confidence, and it's a really important opportunity for me to be able to connect with the state of California, with which, as you know, Japan has a very long tradition of close bond. And of course, I very much enjoyed the tour. The library kindly gave me a little earlier. And incidentally, I'm something of an amateur historian, and I published 2 biographies of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher in Japan. And my secret ambition is to write another book on American leader. And if I do that, I think that Richard Nixon would be the prime candidate. So, the coming here is an element of a research trip. And, the tour of the library really whetted my appetite. But that being said, I'm afraid the project has to wait for the time being, because if I start writing a book a few months after the start of my duty, I think I would be accused of being negligent in my duties in Tokyo. So I think I'll wait a little bit before I start anything. But anyway, I have been asked to speak about President Nixon and the 50th anniversary of the signing on June the 17th of 1971 of the agreement that returned Okinawa to Japan. But let me start a little more broadly than that. Ask yourselves, what was Richard Nixon's connection to Asia? I suppose the first connection was his Navy service during World War II, when he was stationed on Guadalcanal in the South Pacific for a time. I can't imagine how that experience influenced his views, but as you know, there were thousands of deaths and great destruction during this period. But what really reveals to me his connection and his interest was a tour of Asia he made in October of 1953 as vice president, including visit to Japan. This occurred just months after he and President Eisenhower were inaugurated. When you read of this trip, it is quite remarkable. He and Mrs. Nixon were gone for over 2 months. One account said 68 days, another account said 72 days. One account said 19 countries were visited, another account said more than a dozen. Both accounts said he covered over 38,000 miles. But imagine a vice president today committing that amount of time to one area of the globe. That was not just a tour, it was a statement of commitment. The vice president even visited Okinawa, but what caught my eye was a luncheon speech he made to the America-Japan Society in Tokyo. He was a very young vice president at the time, as you know. When he went on that tour, he was only 40 years old. And yet the speech had an expansiveness to it and a boldness. He even said that the US made a mistake in 1946 in pushing for Japanese disarmament. But here is the point I want to make. My proposition to you today is that Richard Nixon was the first major American elected official to truly see the importance and potential of Asia. The only other American president or vice president before President Nixon that comes to my mind would perhaps be President Millard Fillmore, who sent Admiral Perry sailing into Tokyo Bay in 1853, exactly 100 years before Richard Nixon's tour. Now, why do I say then Vice President Nixon was the first major national political leader to see the importance of Asia? Let me quote to you some of his own words from that Tokyo speech. He said that the Eisenhower administration recognized, I quote, the basic fact that what happens in Asia is just as important as what happens in Europe, the end of the quote. That is a remarkable thing to say. From American perspective, back then, Asia did not share history with the US as Europe did. We did not share culture. We did not, at that time, share the economic ties that had developed between the US and Europe over a couple of 100 years. Most of Asia at that point was a developing part of the world. And yet there is a statement, what happens in Asia is just as important as what happens in Europe. He also said in the same speech, Japan was a key bastion in the defense of freedom in Asia. Now, part of this related to the purpose of his overall trip, which was to bolster America's standing in Asia in the face of the Cold War. And another reason he said this, I hope, was that American leaders looked to a day when Japan would emerge from the ravages of the war and become a prosperous and contributing member of the democratic nation that formed the bulwark against communism. And communism was a major theme of his speech that day. He also expressed his desire for a place of Japan in the United Nations. Japan was admitted into the UN only in 1956 3 years after this speech. This statement tells me that he and the administration somehow foresaw the international role that Japan could play. It is a role that we have grown into today, and it is in so many ways beyond the United Nations. Back then, it was a vote of confidence which Japan needed. In short, the Vice President addressed Japan as a nation that belonged in the community of nations. He addressed Japan as a nation whose influence for peace and prosperity would be welcome and important. He spoke to us as a nation that had a role to play in Asia and in the world. This was one short year after the end of the occupation and the return of Japanese sovereignty. It was 7 years before the US and Japan would have a security treaty. On the Vice President Asian tour, he also visited Hong Kong and the countries around China, and I wonder how that influenced his famous opening to China. He visited Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, and I wonder how he reflected on those meetings when nearly 20 years later, as president, he thought to extract the United States out of Vietnam. And I wonder in what way his visit to Okinawa influenced his decision on its reversion to Japan years later. So, how did the reversion come about? Saying it was made possible a growing understanding between two nations is a bit vague. I believe it was made possible by the hard political decisions on the part of President Nixon and Prime Minister Sato after very difficult negotiations. Dr. Kissinger was directly involved in the negotiations on the reversion, and if he were here, I would express my deep appreciation to him for his efforts. There is also no denying the tensions of the time. There were wounds from the war on both sides that had not healed. Suspicions lingered, and naturally so. Japan and the United States had not yet established the close and warm relationship we have today. Treaties are often tricky things. In 1960, there were massive street demonstrations in Japan, even political upheaval after the signing of the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security, which updated the Treaty of 1952. The cabinet resigned a month after the Diet ratified the treaty in 1960. Things had quieted down by 1971, of course, but there were tensions over US bases among the people of Okinawa. Okinawa is not just an island. It's extremely important geographically in terms of security then and now. During World War II, it was known as a keystone of the Pacific. The Reversion Treaty said that Okinawa Prefecture would be returned to Japan and the United States would still have access. During the negotiations, there were difficulties about the date of reversion and complications regarding the feelings of local people about the presence of the US bases and troops. Radical students who didn't want the US in Okinawa rioted in Tokyo with Molotov cocktails and steel pipes. A police officer was even killed. On Okinawa itself, there was the Koza riot in 1970. Koza is the name of place. The riot that ensued carried on for 7-8 8 hours into the night, and 5,000 Okinawans and 700 MPs were involved. In the morning, 60 Americans and 27 Okinawans were injured to varying degrees. Now, why do I mention all this? Because it shows these were not just dry and formal diplomatic negotiations. These are political and security implications for both sides. The measure of trust and courage was demanded on both sides. The President Nixon and Prime Minister Sato each saw what needed to be done for the future and the security of our relationship, and they did it. They reached an agreement. Today, of course, many facilities and areas remain dedicated to U.S. forces in Japan. The tensions resulting from this presence will flare, especially when something unfortunate occurrence happens. It is the policy of Japanese government to work to mitigate the impact on Okinawa while working to maintain the strong deterrence posture by the U.S. forces in the region. As Japan has increased its vision of its defense needs over the years, I think President Nixon would be very pleased. He would be pleased to see such advances as a recent legislation for peace and security under the Abe administration, which allows the exercise of the right of collective self-defense under certain requirements. He would be pleased to see how closely today American forces and Japan self-defense forces cooperate and train together, and the level of integration that we have achieved. He would be also pleased with Prime Minister Suga's visit to the United States on April the 16th as a President Biden's the first foreign guest, and a clear statement of the United States' unwavering support for Japan's defense under the U.S.-Japan Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security, and reaffirmation of the fact Article 5 of that treaty applies to Senkaku Islands. President Trump also had made this pledge. I mention the Senkaku Islands because of the tensions with China and because I believe their specific inclusion shows the trust and common outlook we have developed since the reversion of Okinawa 50 years ago. The tremendous efforts made by those involved in the reversion of Okinawa have led to the strong Japan-US alliance that exists today. Former National Security Advisor for the President, Mr. O'Brien, who was participating in today's event, has been instrumental in strengthening the Japan-US relations, and I would like to express my gratitude to him. Let me close my remarks with this thought. My motivating mission as Japan's ambassador is to build relationships with the new administration and various other leaders, and to further those policies that strengthen our alliance and promote mutual understanding between our two countries. With President Nixon's international vision as my model, I will do my best to live up to his example. So again, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And I want to thank the Embassy of Japan in Washington for your cooperation today, and the Consulate-General in Los Angeles, particularly Consul General Muto, who just stepped out. I want to thank him in particular for his partnership and for his friendship. Mr. Ambassador, you talked about President Nixon as a potential biography subject. Here's a place to start. This is a leather-bound copy of President Nixon's book, Leaders, which he wrote in 1982, which I made reference to earlier, in which there is a chapter on Shigeru Yoshida, Prime Minister Yoshida. So this is our gift to you.
Thank you very much.
And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes today's conference. I want to thank you for your participation here today, for being with us. We invite you to enjoy refreshments in the gardens and tours, self-guided tours of the Nixon Library. Again, Mr. Ambassador, we are deeply honored that you were here today, and thank you very much.